What happens when the grimmest universe in sci-fi meets the most bored hero in anime? Saitama, shopping bag in hand, takes a wrong turn through a cosmic sale aisle and lands in Warhammer 40k, where hope is a myth. The bureaucracy bites harder than demons, and everything wants to kill everything else forever. But what if the Immaterium met a man it simply couldn't quantify? This is a tongue-in-cheek, lore-friendly, well, mostly, crossover, where deadpan comedy uppercuts grimdark tragedy. Let's see how one normal guy with absurd strength tilts the balance of a galaxy that refuses to be saved. The automatic doors side open with that cheerful little bing all fluorescent-lit supermarkets have, and a wall of heat hit him like an open oven. The air smelled not of air conditioning and disinfectant, but of promethium, hot metal, and fear. Sirens howled from vox horns bolted to stained plasteel. Somewhere close, a woman screamed a prayer that rhymed. Saitama blinked, adjusted the plastic handles of his shopping bag on his wrist, and took 2 steps onto a street that had no business being under artillery fire. The boulevard was a canyon between hive stacks, kilometer-tall apartment slabs, stitched together with gantries and laundry lines that had somehow found the courage to exist in a blast zone. Red-picked signs flickered propaganda. Trust authority. Obey. Smile. A formation of guardsmen, thinner than they should be, eyes red from smoke, scrambled behind a low wall of ferrocrete and sandbags. Their sergeant, face a map of old burns, slapped a fresh power pack into his lasgun and shouted over the klaxons, "Stand to! Emperor with us!" Across the plaza, the ground moved. Not dirt. Chitin, a thing the size of a battle tank, all armored plates and hatred, shouldered through a toppled statue. Its massive talons were wet with oil and blood, its maw a spiral of teeth used for digesting tanks and theology alike. The earth around its feet steamed where acid drooled. It sniffed the air, oriented toward the thickest concentration of living fear, and charged. Saitama glanced left and right. No neatly labeled freezer aisles, no discount, 2-for-1 stickers. He looked up at a billboard that helpfully instructed citizens to report heretics. "Ah," he said, "not the supermarket." The Carnifex, if anyone had had the breath to name it, plowed forward, smashing a troop carrier aside in a fountain of sparks. A guardsman beside the sergeant whispered, "By the," and never finished, because vocabulary has limits. Las fire stitched the creature's face in panicked red, flickering against its carapace like birthday candles in a hurricane. A commissar stalked into the open, cape soot-black power sword rising like a sermon. "Hold the line! Die standing!" The Carnifex lowered its head and screamed. Saitama shifted the bag to his left hand so the eggs wouldn't crack, stepped into the thing's path and punched it. There was no thunderclap, no cinematic slow motion. There was a pop, like an overinflated balloon giving up on life. And then a fine confetti of chitin and meat pattered down across the plaza like morbid snow. A half-second later, the shockwave arrived. Not because the punch created one, or maybe it did, who can say, but because the city couldn't decide how else to react. Sandbags slumped. A saint's statue leaned, reconsidered its theological commitments, and then resumed leaning. The guardsmen's helmets lifted and resettled on their heads like a magician's cheap trick. Silence tried to happen, failed, and tried again. The sergeant stared. The commissar looked down at his unswung blade as if it had said something embarrassing. Somewhere, an engineer's auspex spat a line graph that flatlined in a way graphs don't. A nearby cogitator, tasked with measuring kinetic transfer, printed a strip of paper that read, and then burst into tears of oil. Saitama flicked a speck off his glove. "Do you guys know where the vegetables are?" There was supposed to be a sale. No one answered, because the brain needs a minute after reality swerves. The commissar found his voice first, because duty is a muscle. He snapped, "Identify yourself. Name, homeworld, and oath to the throne." "Saitama," he said. City Z?" He paused, trying to remember if he'd ever sworn an oath to anything other than bargains. "I'm like a hero, for fun, and not overpaying." The psyker attached to the squad, young, eyes like a haunted mirror, tilted her head. One gloved hand rose, fingers splayed, and the air rippled around Saitama, as if heat shimmer had learned manners. The ripple tried to grip him, slid off, tried again, and sighed. She blinked rapidly, swallowed, and very carefully lowered her hand. "He's quiet," she said, as if reporting a comet sighting that had politely apologized. A picked capturer servo skull drifted closer, whirring. It tried to focus on Saitama and got a shot of the bag handles instead. It tried again and captured a beautiful high-resolution image of his sleeve. The skull, shamed, circled toward the engineer, who smacked it with a wrench that had scripture etched along the handle. The street remembered it was a war. A living wave of lesser bioforms scuttled into view, gaunts by the hundred, chittering, rifles grown from their arms. The platoon reflexively braced to die well. Saitama looked at his shopping list, which was written in ballpoint and confidence. Eggs, done. Scallions, onions, cabbage, coupons. He sighed, took a step, and was suddenly in the middle of the swarm. Hands, gloved, soft, absurdly ordinary, blurred. Wherever he moved his arm, Tyranids became an unhelpful mist. Where he pointed, the street cleared. His punches were almost apologetic, like tapping dust off a windowsill. A gaunt leapt. He pinched its skull between finger and thumb, frowned at the crunch, and set the remains gently on a pile of not bodies. A leaping warrior found itself politely redirected into a wall, which cratered, considered whether to remain a wall, and chose rubble instead. He ended up beside the commissar again, who hadn't moved. The man's hat had migrated slightly left. "I authorize you," the commissar said hoarsely, grasping at the nearest plausible sentence, "to proceed to the administratum for, registration." "Is that where the market is?" Saitama asked. "It is where everything is." The commissar gestured up the avenue, where a freeway of armored vehicles was attempting to be traffic, while also being a battle. "Ask for a purchasing clerk, or a quartermaster, or a confessor. Ask for someone." "Cool." Saitama nodded, adjusted his capelet collar thing, and started walking. Las rounds flicked past. He leaned slightly to one side so one wouldn't scuff his shirt. A collapsing Hab spire, encouraged by an ill-advised artillery strike, began to peel away from its moorings like a stale wafer. He reached up and steadied it with a palm, pressing lightly until the groaning stopped. People on balconies, their faces pillars of soot and tears, watched him as one watches a miracle. One is not sure one deserves. he crossed an intersection where a chimera had lost 3 wheels and all composure. A child in a rust-colored coat peered from beneath it. Saitama crouched, lifted the vehicle with 2 fingers, and rolled it aside so carefully that no one inside spilled their ammunition. The squad inside stared. One of them muttered a hymn of thanks that sounded suspiciously like a football chant. He passed a ragged choir of ecclesiarchy faithful, hammering out a dirge on a portable organ. He passed an arco-flagellant twitching in post-battle stillness, its restraints humming. He passed a vendor who had not evacuated because he knew, with the certainty of old men and cats, that war and business are cousins. The vendor offered him a ration bar with an entrepreneurial smile. Saitama accepted, bit into it, and chewed thoughtfully. Cardboard, he assessed, but with hope. By the time he reached an archway labeled Munitorum, Civilian Interface, Please queue calmly, the battle had turned into a different battle. He stepped into a hall big enough to park a Titan in and was immediately met by a queue. The queue ran past pillars covered in purity seals, around a reliquary full of bolts fired by a saint, through a gift shop that sold framed litanies, and out the other end of the hive. He took a number from a brass dispenser, 8,278,511. A picked screen over the counter displayed, now serving 12. He looked at the number. He looked at the counter. He considered the heat death of the universe, weighed it against bureaucratic throughput, and determined they were in the same ballpark. A servo skull drifted down behind the counter. Its quill attachment scratched on parchment without moving. Purpose of visit? It intoned. I'm looking for the market, Saitama said. Veggies. Discounts, if possible. The skull hovered, made a thinking noise, and imprinted a tiny stamp on a tiny card that said possibly. Please wait while I fetch a navigational servitor. He waited. He had the patience of a rock that didn't ask to be a rock. People in line behind him craned to stare and then pretended they weren't craning. A boy asked if he was a space marine. Saitama said, No, I'm just bald. The boy nodded as if given a secret. 10 minutes and 3 hymns later, the skull returned, bobbing with something like pride. I have been authorized to guide you to procurement pathways, it said. Please do not attempt to purify, bless, or otherwise interfere with sacred data lines. Sure. The skull floated out into the street, bobbing like a sin that had made peace with itself. Saitama followed, stepping over a still steaming crater, sipping from a canteen someone had pressed on him and forgotten. The sirens dimmed as they moved toward the hive's mid-levels, into avenues where the war was a sound instead of a touch. Above, the sky was the color of old iron. Something green streaked across it, then another something, then a dozen more, painting contrails like crude graffiti. No one looked up. No one ever did. Not because they didn't care, but because looking up in a hive was a hobby that got you killed by falling debris or promoted by accident. The servo skull halted, rotated, and chimed. Market district ahead, it said. Caveat. Market is a flexible designation. Caveat. Current status may be altered by externalities categorized as incoming. Caveat. Do not panic. I don't really. A warning klaxon hammered the sky so hard it made the buildings flinch. The skull's pict lens focused, dilated, and focused again, showing Saitama a tiny magnified vista of the heavens. Dots growing lines, lines fattening into objects, objects catching fire because planets have a way of making arrivals dramatic. The skull whispered, almost reverently. Designation: Impactors. Saitama scratched his cheek. So tall. Not cucumbers. Statistically, no. He sighed, looked at the plastic bag on his wrist, like a man measuring the distance between desire and what happens instead, and kept walking. They hooded him for the ride, because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. The hood smelled like incense, ozone, and a little like fried circuits. He said nothing because he didn't have anything useful to add, and because the stormtroopers who had arrived at the Administratum Hall in a wash of black armor and clarion orders seemed very tired. They cuffed his wrists with manacles that claimed on their box to restrain ogrins. The cuff chain sagged like a complaint, then snapped with a soft metallic whine when Saitama shifted his grip on the bag. No one noticed, or everyone noticed and chose not to. The transport rumbled and rattled, climbed and dove, and then slid sideways in a way that made even Saitama understand they were landing with urgency. Hands guided him down a ramp. Boots clanged on grating. The hood came off, and he was in a room that was part temple, part surgery, part engine shrine, a place built by people who distrusted comfort but believed in corners. Candles guttered in the recycled air. Wards and sigils were etched into every surface, with the obsessive intensity of a man carving his wedding vows into the hull of a battleship. Servo skulls flitted like metal moths. In the center, behind a desk that could have been used as a cover in a siege, sat an interrogator in sober robes. She had the poise of a guillotine. "Identify yourself," she said. It wasn't a request so much as a ritual. Saitama. Origin. City Z. He offered it with the mild hope that this time it would make sense. A psyker stood to her left, hood up, silver filaments running from her skull cap into a bank of gnashing cogitators. Her face was young, the way glass is young. She lifted a hand, palm open, and pressure rolled off her like heat off a forge. It pressed against Saitama and found nothing to push. Her mouth tightened. The filaments sang. The cogitator's paper reels stuttered, and her pupils blew wide as if a fireworks display had gone off behind her eyes. "What do you see?" the interrogator asked without looking. "A horizon," the psyker breathed, "and a receipt. Eggs. Scallions." Her nose bled delicately, like a wine glass that had been told a cruel joke. "Null?" the interrogator asked, now looking. "No." The psyker dabbed at the blood with a purity-sealed cloth that smoked. "Not null. Not anything." She shivered. It's like staring at a closed door that is not a door. They did the tests. They always did the tests. A chirurgeon with a mechadendrite for a conscience examined his bones with auspex and made a small, unhappy noise because his bone density was simply rude. A confessor sprinkled blessed oils that slid off his skin as if his pores politely declined sacrament. Hexagrammic wards brightened, dimmed, brightened, and then gave up and became vaguely attractive wallpaper. A null rod approached his shoulder, buzzed with ugly intent, and then buzzed at itself, confused. A stormtrooper fired a bolt round at a wall behind Saitama to gauge reflexes. Saitama reached out, pinched the round between thumb and forefinger before it could decide whether to explode, frowned at the little skull icon on its casing, and set it down on the desk. The interrogator put a bead on it and wordlessly slid it into a blast box with tongs. It thumped once inside like a petulant child. "Purpose," the interrogator said at last, steepling her fingers. Her rings were all machine oaths and tiny reliquaries. Everyone has one, even vermin. I was going to the store, Saitama said. There was a sale. A sale. The word tasted like alien doctrine in her mouth. And afterward? He considered. He had a memory of days, of ceiling cracks, of mosquitoes, of all the small, unspectacular heroism that he never talked about, because talking felt like asking for change. Afterward, he said, probably go home. The interrogator studied him for a long breath, and then 3 more, during which 3 dozen servo-servitors recorded her silence in triplicate. Finally, she flicked her eyes at the psyker. Threat calculus? Direct threat, non-existent unless provoked, the psyker said, voice small but steady. Indirect threat, existential to our understanding of everything. Potential utility, unquantifiable. He could close a warp breach by asking nicely, or punch it. Useful monster, the interrogator murmured, an old doctrine waking in her bones. Or saint, or both. Saints are monsters with better press. A stormtrooper coughed in the manner of someone trying not to exist audibly. The interrogator reached under the desk, pressed 2 sigil-studded seals, and a brass plate slid aside to reveal a stack of parchments. She stamped 12 blessings onto a vellum card with bored precision, wrote 30 death warrants on 30 strips of paper with the same hand, and layered them together with a clip. You will carry these, she said, sliding the stack across. They state that you are both authorized and condemned. That way whoever meets you can be right. Saitama nodded, because paperwork was paperwork no matter the galaxy. He tucked the stack into his shopping bag beside the eggs. The interrogator stood. We will not detain you, she said, and everyone in the room subtly became happier and more terrified at the same time. But you will be observed. Touched by the warp or not, anomalies draw attention. We will try to ensure it is our attention first. Do you require anything? A map, Saitama said. To the market. A servo skull floated forward, the way a dog approaches a new person. It has decided might be a friend. It extended a little hollow projector with the proud innocence of a child revealing a crayon drawing. A map of the hive unfolded in mid-air, lines upon lines upon lines. This unit can guide, the skull said, voice softer than its speaker should allow. I have subroutines for traffic avoidance and liturgical shortcuts. Thanks, Saitama said. They let him go. The hood stayed off this time. The stormtroopers kept pace at a distance that read as, "We are not escorting you, if you were a lawyer." The corridor opened onto a balcony overlooking a city that never stopped being a city, even when it was a furnace. The sky had grown new streaks, green, fast, purposeful. Voxcasters began to chant numbers. The servo skull rotated to face him as if it had a face, as if eyes were not simply functions. Market District, it said, and pointed its little light along a downward spiraling avenue. We should proceed quickly. Because of the incoming? He asked. Because of everything, the skull said, and somehow made it sound practical instead of poetic. Saitama tightened the loop of the bag around his wrist, glanced at his list, and set off, the skull bobbing, the city groaning, the first green fireballs sketching curved invitations into the clouds. The servo skull's lantern eye painted the corridor ahead in a cone of thin light as it led him down a spiral of metal balconies. Below, the hive's mid-levels were packed with market stalls, cobbled from pilgrim crates and tank armor plates. Strings of lumen bulbs threw nervous halos onto tarpaulins, stamped with double-headed eagles. For a precious few minutes, war became the dull hum behind commerce. Hawkers chanting prayers and prices in the same breath. A butcher offering something that claimed to be grox. A toothless woman selling rosaries made from laser gun fuses. The sky above hiccuped green. At first it sounded like distant laughter, then like engines laughing. Trails of fire gouged the cloud deck. A shadow fell across the market, big, irregular, and smug. Someone shouted, "Roquet!" and someone else shouted, "No, it's a cruiser, or a bit of one." And then everyone stopped having opinions and ran. The servo skull leaned closer to Saitama, as if proximity could equal safety. Advisory: Xenos incursion. Designation: Orcoid. Subdesignation: WAG in progress. Okay, Saitama said, hearing only incursion and translating it to detour. The first impact shook dust from 20 levels of joists. A ramshackle drop pod assembled from stolen futures, and optimism smashed through a hab roof and unfolded like a flower that had read too much about saw blades. Orcs poured out in a rolling, roaring tumble. Green fists, iron plates, gun barrels like organ pipes, teeth like payday. Their collective yell landed on the air like a blow. The market's plates shuddered under 1,000 boot stomps. They saw the mass of human bodies and pointed. Hands waved axes. Guns fired bullets that hadn't been told not to bend. Banners that were really tarps on pipes declared ownership of things still being fought over. At the center of the crashing tide, bigger than his mob by a debt of bones, came the war boss. Ugskraga Gut Krumpa wore mega armor the size of a small apartment. Chains and exhausts and plates and spikes and something suspiciously like a tank tread circled his waist. Squig hides were nailed to him like medals. His mega claw clicked with theatrical menace, a parading guillotine. Jutting from his jaw, a tusk split and plated, glittered with captured purity seals. He carried a banner that was just his own name, spelled in teeth, because sometimes literacy hurts. He took in Saitama, bald, caped, carrying a white plastic bag like a milkman in hell. "Shiny head," Ugskraga said, pleased, pointing with the claw. "Dibs," the boys bellowed. It was, in its way, supportive. Saitama shifted his grip on the bag, so the eggs faced inward. "You guys know where the vegetable aisle is?" He gestured at the servo skull, which tried to hide behind its own quill. Ugskraga didn't listen, because listening isn't very orc. He threw one arm out, drawing a circle in the air, and the excitement rose another notch. "Nobs! Crump dat one! I's savin' him for me." 6 knobs thundered forward, enormous and delighted. Each had a different theory of what an axe should be. One had simply decided yes and brought a door with nails in it. Their boots pounded the deck like a drum line. Saitama took a small step so he wouldn't scuff his shoes and flicked his finger. The lead knob's helmet spun around, backwards with a clonk, like a bell, and he sat down to figure out what the new reality meant. The second knob's door axe drifted upward, as if second-guessing life choices, and he followed it into the rafters with the slow spiral of laundry. 3 and 4 tripped over each other so gracefully they would have needed choreography to do worse. The last 2 lunged together and found themselves gently lying on a pile of stall tarps, tucked in by invisible hands. The tarps wrote, "Closeout sale," in dust. The boys faltered. Orcs don't do quiet, but they flirted with it. "The warg! which his belief yelling itself into being, rippled. A weird boy at the back, head wrapped in scrap copper like a saint of bad ideas, began to swell with collected enthusiasm. Green lightning crawled across his skin, eager to be drama. The servo skull bobbed in horrified awe. Advisory: contact with Xenos Psyker will result in... Static? Saitama suggested. The weird boy pointed both hands at Saitama and opened his mouth to announce his own legend. A geyser of emerald energy blasted outward, the raw collective will of brutes distilled into zap. It reached Saitama and made a noise like a soda going flat. The bolt collapsed into a puddle of tame sparks that rolled around his boots like guilty confetti. Saitama, concerned for the bag, lifted it a little. A single spark tried to leap inside, saw the eggs, and decided to be a better spark. The weird boy blinked, deflated, and sat down abruptly. The boys looked at him, at Saitama, and then at each other as the warg's pressure bled away like excitement after someone says, "We should probably fill out forms first." Ugskrugga roared to rally confidence. "Stop mucking about! He's just a Hume with a Polish head. I's gonna crump him myself." He stamped forward, every step punctuated by engine coughs from his armor. The mega claw hummed as it wound up, gears meshing in a grind that wanted applause. He swung. The claw came down with the kind of commitment that pulpifies heresy and small moons. Saitama, mindful of the eggs, met it with a jab. The jab wasn't even a jab. It was a suggestion that the universe accept a minor correction. The mega claw stopped with a neat clack and then gently crumpled like a paper cup. Ugskrugga's arm continued with its plan, found its plan had cancelled itself, and decided to be elsewhere. The warboss froze with his mouth open, the very image of a man whose punchline had been moved. Orcs live in a reality that respectfully bends to their confidence, but confidence is a fickle deity. Across the mob, chests fell an inch. Shooters that had been firing at impressively sideways angles sputtered. A deaf dread lumbering in the rear hesitated mid-stomp, one leg still raised as if embarrassed to be noticed. One boy tried to fix the mood. "Red wounds go faster," he declared, patting the red stripe on his gun. The gun considered its obligations and jammed with a ladylike cough. Saitama reached out and tapped Ugskrugga lightly on the breastplate with 2 fingers. The massive orc lifted off the floor, sailed backward through his own banner like a child ruining a birthday photo, and settled into a stall piled with fungal snacks. Mushrooms exploded into a beige cloud. The warboss sat up slowly, spores dusting his tusks, eyes crossing briefly in an internal debate about dignity. He looked at his mega claw, now the shape of regret, and then at Saitama, who was examining a package of something that looked like beef jerky if beef grew on rocks. Saitama tore it open with a tiny rip and tasted a strip. He chewed, thoughtful. "Like old socks," he said, nodding, but with confidence. A single Gretchen, braver than common sense due to being too small for it, scuttled up and tugged on Saitama's cape. "Excuse me, mister," it squeaked. "What is you?" "Just a guy," Saitama said, bending so the Gretchen wouldn't have to shout. "Looking for vegetables." The Gretchen considered this. "Vegetar bulls is green," it said helpfully, patting its own arm. "We is green." It beamed, having solved someone's problem at last, then scurried away as 2 boys argued over whether that meant they could be eaten. On a catwalk above, a pair of Ordo Xenos scribes watched through monoculars, ink sticks quivering. A battered field auspex in the hands of an engine seer complained in binary. "Local wah! Field measurement," he muttered, tapping. The needle swung past numbers into a region labeled with a cog and a frown. He added, in grease pencil across the bottom of his slate, "Subject appears to exert counter-hype." Notes: reality not bothered. An acolyte on the Vox whispered, "Are we classifying this as demon, abhuman, or—" And his handler murmured back, "Classify it as, don't touch it." Down below, orc culture did what it always does under confusing stimuli. It tried to make a new story. A boy with a scar that spelled M-O-M, maybe standing for Mork, or maybe Gork, jabbed a stubby finger at Saitama. "That's a puncher god," he said with sudden religious conviction. "He ain't shooty, he ain't choppy, he's punchy." The idea tickled the mob. Heads bobbed. A knob who had been using an iron gate as a shield stopped, reconsidered his life, and carefully bent the gate into the shape of a bald head. Ugskraga heaved himself up, fissures spidering across his pride. He rolled his shoulders, spat out a rivet, and grinned like a landslide. "You think you tough, little Humie," he said, though his voice grated like a gearbox missing teeth. "Well, I think you's a good scrap, my best scrap." His eyes lit with the genuine joy orcs reserve for anything that might be fun to hit. "Join me, wah! We'll go crump everything, start with that place." He pointed at a sign that said, "Procurement, perishables." It had a carrot painted on it, possibly as a devotional. Saitama squinted. "That says vegetables." "That says loot," Ugskraga said, magnanimous. "Loot is everything you can carry, plus some." Saitama imagined pushing a cart down an aisle while 1,000 greenskins practiced sharing. He imagined the eggs. "I'll pass." Another orc tried a different tactic. Awe. He stepped forward, removed his helmet, which was a bucket with a face drawn on, and bowed with elaborate clanking. "Boss," he said reverently, "show us the secret punch." "There's no secret," Saitama said. "You just punch." He demonstrated a gentle straight, barely disturbing the air. The orc imitated it, nearly fell over, recovered, and gasped as if given fire. "He does Occam's razor with his fist," muttered a mech, scribbling notes on a plate with a nail. He held up a jittering device. Wires, tubes, a skull somewhere not entirely ornamental. The dial spun, hiccuped, and landed on a hand-painted sector labeled Meh. The mech nodded, satisfied. "That's new." In the back, a stomper, an illegal cathedral of iron and bad dreams, blundered through a wall, searching for a narrative to belong to. It raised one massive riveted foot. The servo skull squealed and darted up, the quill scribbling prayers in terrified italics. Saitama glanced up, put his free hand to the air, and caught the foot as it came down. The world flexed, bolts whined. The stomper balanced on his palm like a child on a seesaw. Orcs on its upper decks screamed and waved and threw beer. Saitama tilted his wrist slightly and set the gargantuan machine down on an empty plaza 2 blocks over, careful as placing a glass. The plaza's pigeons, which were actually maintenance drones, lifted in a front, whirred and resettled to be offended later. "The wah!" hiccuped again. Somewhere, an orc banner lost an exclamation point. Ugskraga looked at his boys and did the math he knew. Could he beat this Humie? Probably not. Could he follow him and claim credit for a really good fight? Definitely. He threw both arms wide. Right. New plan. This Hume is a boss. Maybe da boss. We follows him till dares things to hit, then we hit him. Quiet war, lads, he pantomimed, lowering the volume of his own roar, brow furrowing with the effort. Whoa, but you know, polite-like. Wah, the mob tried, deeply confused and suddenly adorable. Saitama looked at the servo skull, which was hovering with the exhausted happiness of a bureaucrat whose queue has unexpectedly sorted itself. Is the market safe? The skull rotated in place, lenses dilating. Market status, volatile. However, perishable goods are perishing at an accelerated rate due to local thermodynamic anomalies. If we proceed now, there is a 64% chance of acquiring vegetables before they become soup. Let's go, Saitama said. He started walking. The orcs parted in a clank of deference, a sea of green receding around a man in a sail-stickered universe. Ugskraga fell in 2 paces behind, massive like a moon that had made peace with its orbit. Boys followed, hesitating, trying wag on their tongues like a new swear word. A knob lifted a squig and shushed it. The squig, scandalized, shushed back. They crossed the market floor, past stalls miraculously unlooted, because no one was sure what the rules were anymore. A vendor held up a crate of limp, grayish leaves. Saitama took one, sniffed, nodded. Cabbage-ish. He put a few in his bag, tucked them snugly beside the eggs and the stack of blessings and death warrants, and handed the vendor a coin he'd acquired from somewhere that didn't remember giving it. The vendor stared at the coin, then at Saitama's retreating back, and then carefully nailed the coin to his stall as a relic. On the balcony, the Inquisition scribe scribbled, "Subject walks through orc formation unmolested," he murmured. Wah! Amplitude continues to lower case. Note to self, petition Lex Mechanic for typographical litany on exclamation point sanctity. Saitama paused at a junction where arrows for ammunition, confession, and produce all pointed in confusing directions. The servo skull hovered decisively under produce, which was blinking because someone had wired it into the same circuit as AIR raid. He took the stairs down, past a mural of a saint who was punching a dragon with scriptural approval. He gave the mural a small nod, which it didn't see, and turned into an aisle that smelled faintly of earth. It wasn't much. Crates of tubers dyed by the light of an alien sun, a basket of mushrooms that looked like they had opinions, a stand of wilted greens guarded by a woman with a scar down her cheek, and the peculiar calm of someone who knows exactly how many times the world can end and still be a day. She watched the greens tremble under the aftershock of the orcs' respectful wah, watched a war boss the size of a bed frame wait his turn, watched a bald man pick up a cabbage and check for bruises. "Prices are posted," she said, in a voice that could break glass or hearts depending on the target. Saitama read the slate, did the math of teeth and thrones and nothing much, and paid in whatever the universe accepted from him. He packed the vegetables, tied the bag carefully, and gave the servo skull a light pat of appreciation that made its gyros hum. Ugskraga leaned close, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble that still shook bolts. "So, he said, almost shy. "We do quiet war now, yeah? But like when there's a real big fight, we can turn it up a bit? For fun?" "For fun," Saitama agreed, deadpan. The war boss grinned, real and fierce and weirdly wholesome, and slapped a boy on the back so gently the boy only skidded 10 meters. The orcs began filing out in a sort of line, testing the theology of polite as if it were a new caliber. Somewhere, a mech painted a small bald circle on his banner and declared it very killy. Somewhere else, the weird boy coughed up the last of his disappointing lightning and decided to take up drumming. Saitama looked at his list. Eggs, safe. Scallions, questionable. Onions, in hand. Cabbage, secured. Coupons. The hive did not, it turned out, do coupons. It did absolutions. He shrugged, content. The servo skull chimed. Route to exit, clear. Secondary objective, avoid administratum queue. Tertiary objective, continue not dying. Working on it, Saitama said, and stepped back into the war that, being itself, had briefly learned to whisper. The first sign was the smell, and it didn't belong to any kitchen. Air that had been dust and oil became copper and cinnamon, like coins warming on a stove. Lumen bulbs along the avenue started blinking out of rhythm with themselves, on, off, each filament convinced it was the choir director. Somewhere, a vox horn stuttered an alarm that couldn't decide which syllable it feared most. The servo skull slowed, quill trembling without writing. Advisory, it whispered, and even its tinny voice tried to keep the vowels inside. Local Geller integrity, wobbling. Probability of unlicensed metaphysics, escalating. Saitama checked the bag looped on his wrist, as if unlicensed metaphysics might jostle eggs. The cabbage pressed companionably against the carton. He adjusted the knot, nodded to the skull. We still on the way to produce? In a topological sense, the skull said, which is how bureaucrats announce that geometry is about to take offense. They turned into a plaza that had once been a basilica's front steps and now served as everything. Parade ground, market overflow, emergency triage, impromptu choir loft. The steps rose in broad tiers toward a facade, heavy with saints punching dragons, serpents, metaphors. Hymnals hung in iron cages, pages fluttering in a wind that hadn't been there a moment ago. The ecclesiarchy choir, teenagers and grandparents, anyone with a throat, sang a battle hymn that tried to be brave for them. Their breath fogged in sudden cold. A seam appeared in the sky. Not a crack. Those have edges. This was a seam like a mouth pressed tight, trying not to laugh and failing. It unzipped, and what poured through wasn't light, but intention shaped into brightness. The plaza's shadows went the wrong way. A candle flame leaned toward its wick, as if reconsidering the contract. Statues turned their heads to face somewhere that didn't exist yet. Designation, warp breach, the servo skull reported, as if filing minutes. Sub-designation, do not. The choir's hymn cracked in the middle like a boy's voice, and then found a deeper note. The priest at their head gripped his rosarius. The string of beads clicked in a pattern that was either prayer or a diagnostic. People knelt because the body knows when the air has teeth. The something that came through wore a shape to be polite about terror. 20 feet of crimson hunger leaned forward on legs like the memory of stampedes. Wings unfurled, not feathered, but built from heat and smoke. Each beat made the banners snap as if slapped. Brass armor hugged tendons that throbbed with drumbeat fury, etched all over with runes that spelled murder in 100 alphabets, and one in particular that wanted to be a scream. In one hand, a chain axe churned like a mill of regrets. In the other, a whip uncoiled, studded segments clinking with glee. Its eyes were furnaces where swords went to be baptized. The plaza tried to run in 6 directions at once and settled for down. "Bloodthirster," said someone who had read too much and not enough. The demon tilted its head, as if listening to its own name with approval. Blue light cracked the air, like ice snapping on a lake. Silver forms slammed into being on the steps, teleport strikes landing with the inevitability of a stamp. The Grey Knights arrived, the Emperor's secret, gleaming where everything else was soot. Their aegis armor was etched with pages you were not supposed to read aloud. Halberds hummed with caged storms. Small purity seals fluttered like captured prayers. A librarian stood among them, a living antenna under a hood of warded metal, his eyes opal bright with calm fury. "Civilians down!" barked a Justicar, his vox amp making the command the second law of thermodynamics. Saitama looked around. Everyone else had already obeyed the first law of keeping your head below your heart. He raised a hand. "Excuse me, produce aisle." The nearest knight pivoted, silver faceplate reflecting a bald man and a plastic bag. The knight hesitated with the palpable confusion of a veteran confronted with something that didn't fit any training picked. "Back," he said, because that was what you said when you had nothing useful to say. "Behind the line. This is not your fight." "It never is," Saitama said, sincerity wearing a joke like a coat. He stepped sideways, so a fleeing pilgrim could slide past without catching her shawl on a broken bolt. The servo skull hovered at shoulder height, conflating courage with a lack of reverse. The bloodthirster wasted nobody's time. It swung, and stone turned to a memory of stone. A grey knight met the chain axe with a halberd. Bird, sparks scribbling light across the steps. The demon's whip drew a red curve in the air. Another knight stepped into it and let his armor take the hymn, knees bending like pillars flexing under new banners. A litany of abjuration rolled from helms, voices locking together into a machine you drove with belief. The librarian extended a palm. A ripple went out, pressure that made the world briefly tighter. The breach quivered, the seam's lips pressed as if to hold a laugh in again. The demon laughed anyway, a furnace cough. It barreled forward, its presence organizing fear into allegiance. Saitama angled toward the edge of the melee like a man skirting a spill in the cereal aisle. "Excuse me," he said, tapping a knight on the shoulder so he could pass. The knight flinched. No one touched Aegis plate. And then, recognizing that he hadn't died, stepped aside the way a door moves for someone who's clearly on an errand. The bloodthirster saw him. It always sees the thing that doesn't belong, because dissonance draws the eye. Its nostrils flared, smelling not blood or rage or the delicious copper perfume of despair, but laundry soap and cabbage. Its lip curled. "Move, please," Saitama said, because manners are armor in any universe. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everything that hurt to look at heard him perfectly. It came down at him like a cathedral deciding to be a guillotine. He put up one hand, fingers relaxed, palm open, a traffic cop calming a stampede. The chain axe kissed his palm and stopped, not with drama, but the way a word stops when you forget the next syllable. The whip cracked. He caught that too, like returning a jump rope to a child. For a sliver of a second, the daemon and the man stood connected by 2 lines of impossible that had become a taut statement. No. Saitama leaned forward and flicked the bloodthirster's forehead. No thunder, no shockwave, just a clear, flat sound. clack, as if you'd rapped a knuckle against a jar to see if it had sealed. A hairline crack ran through the rune, glowing above the demon's brow. The rune looked offended. The whole towering shape trembled, as if remembering that it was an idea pretending to be meat. Then it came apart like bad cake, not exploded. Nothing messy. It sloughed into red motes that had nowhere to go but everywhere, a glitter of unblood that refused to land. The whip sighed into chain segments and fell with a tired clink. The axe choked, turned, and became a pile of quiet metal that looked embarrassed. The seam in the sky zipped its mouth shut with a mortified sound, and the plaza remembered which way shadows go. Silence tried to happen, and this time succeeded on the first attempt. One of the Grey Knights remained braced in a guard position longer than he needed to, and when he realized, he relaxed like a statue that had just remembered it was a man. His voice came through the grill a degree softer. "What in the Emperor's metaphysics?" the librarian murmured, but he wasn't talking to his brothers. He was listening, head tilted slightly, to a feed that wasn't on any vox. The air around Saitama was a weather system with no wind, a stillness that pushed back on things until they were too bored to be spooky. In the Immaterium, if you could say anywhere in particular when talking about inside-out oceans, ripples from the popped bloodthirster chased themselves through storms of howling color. They reached a skull mountain where a throne sat beating like a drum. The thing on the throne leaned forward, tasting a signature that wasn't a signature. A fight that had the form of one punch and the flavor of nothing. Khorne's laugh rattled weapons piled into mountains. Approval? Annoyance? With Khorne, it's the same. Because both mean more. Elsewhere, a labyrinth of feathers and eyes and plans unspooled across itself, knotting destiny into cat's cradles. Numbers crawled up a serpent's sides and added into jokes. Tzinch tried 14 models. Null, number. Perpetual, number. Pariah adjacent, number. The 15th model involved a grocery list and a flat line labeled a desire gradient, at which point the quill broke and the page caught fire out of spite. The architect of change smiled until he realized for one sour beat that there is nothing to change if there is no hook to tug. He smiled again immediately after, because challenges are sugar. In a garden where rot doesn't rot because it is already perfect, a grandfatherly corpulence leaned on a shovel and nodded. Acceptance, Nurgle sighed, delighted. How wholesome. He sent a slug the size of a church toddling off with a ribbon that said "good job" and no instructions. In a palace of nerve ends and velvet, Slaanesh glanced up from an orchestra of sighs, assessed the new note, and put it down with a delicate grimace. Unfashionable, they murmured, and waved for more harps. Back in air that had taxes, lesser demons half born from the breach looked around as if waking from a nap they hadn't meant to take, saw Saitama, and politely flipped inside out into footprints that blew away. A screaming skull hovering above a fountain decided to become a nice pigeon. The fountain appreciated the company. The Justicar approached Saitama like a man holding both gratitude and a live grenade. "You are untainted," he said, and it sounded like an accusation, because grammar has to hang its hat somewhere. "I washed my hands," Saitama offered. The librarian's gaze was a pressure without hands. He reached gently with a mind that had, in previous days, wrestled thoughts wearing claws. His psychic probings went in, found a big room with the lights on, and a grocery receipt on the counter, and came back out again with a polite push that felt like birds leaving a tree. He dabbed at one nostril. A faint pink smudge appeared on his glove, and he examined it with academic curiosity. "Not a null," he said softly, filing the statement between "fire is hot" and "stones fall." "Not a psyker, a phenomenon." "Authorized civilian," said a new voice, sour with authority. The tone of a man who knows he has arrived late and dislikes the implication. An inquisitorial rosette flashed from a collar, lit by a lumen with its own sense of importance. The interrogator from before had, of course, known first. But this was another one with an Ordo Malleus sigil and the energy of a person who wants to recommend caution at a fire. He took Saitama in. Bag, cape, lack of concern. "Under observation," he added, to stake a claim, "and under conditional sanction." Saitama pinged the servo skull with a glance. "Vegetables?" The skull, which had watched a bloodthirster become disappointment confetti, snapped out of its reverie. "Roting," it said, voice steadier now that reality had remembered manners. "Market viability at 37% and rising as panic yields to prayer. New stalls have spontaneously declared themselves under the protection of a statue that winked. Also, eggs are trending fragile." "Okay." Saitama looked at the Grey Knights. "You guys need anything?" A dozen answers fought to be first and lost to the one thing they could actually say. The Justicar inclined his helm. "Keep walking, citizen," he said. It wasn't the phrase he meant, but it was the one the world made room for. The librarian, though, took one step closer and lowered his voice, which was probably unnecessary. Saitama's hearing worked fine. "If you ever choose a war," he said, an odd gentleness threading steel, "we would make room." "I'm a hero for fun," Saitama said, which is the kind of refusal that doesn't demean the offer, only declines the dress code. "And for discounts." The librarian's eyes smiled in their opal. "Then, Emperor willing, may your fun and our wars never be the same errand." He gestured, and the knights moved out, not marching away exactly, but allowing space to be something other than a wall of silver. A tech adept approached, trembling with the excitement of a hypothesis. He extended a sensor like a shy flower. "Per permission to measure your..." "Nothing?" "Sure," Saitama said. The cogitator chewed. Its paper tongue spat out a thin ribbon printed with machine glyphs and a little shrug symbol someone had added as a joke centuries ago, and which had somehow become standard. The adept made a delighted static squeal, bowed 6 times, and scurried off to have a crisis in private. They walked. The plaza recalibrated. The choir's hymn returned, rearranged as Thanksgiving. A little girl emerged from beneath a bench, saw the plastic bag, and asked with holy seriousness, "Is that lunch?" Saitama considered. "Eventually," he said, which satisfied her spiritual needs. Past the basilica, warp sheen clung to the edges of reality like soap scum. The servo skull kept a respectful distance from the glitter and read out a devotion to clarity it had learned when it was a quill on a desk. The words felt like clean water. The warp, being nothing if not a gossip, tried another door. This one didn't open with a tear, but with a whisper. A corridor thickening into fog that smelled like old rain and new flowers. A shape approached, dozens of pale hands playing a harp woven from its own hair, eyes like promises on a stage. The sound wrapped the mind like a hush before applause. People around them went soft at the edges, remembering kisses they had not had and triumphs they hadn't earned. Saitama waited for the chord to resolve. It didn't. He frowned at the demon the way a man frowns at a vending machine that swallowed a coin. His boredom intensified, not anger, not even irritation, just the pure distilled air of a customer service line after lunch. The music faltered because it had never had to survive on stage without attention. The demon, if that's what you call a self-licking ice cream of need, tried a higher harmony. Saitama raised a finger and made the universal hang-on gesture you give an over-eager salesperson. The song tripped over its own hem and turned into a thin squeal. The pale hands paused. One of them, to its own surprise, waved a little wave of apology. The thing dispersed into petals that, once they hit the ground, remembered they were paper and blew away into an alley where a kid would one day use them to make a kite. Designation: predatory art piece, the servo skull noted. Diffused by… It wrote MM in the margins of its own mind and underlined it, twice. A psyker down the street, part of a ragged PDF unit, had been holding the breach's third cousin at bay by chewing glass and reciting multiplication tables. Her eyes had gone the milky blue of sweat. Saitama, on his way past, tapped her on the forehead. "You're okay," he said, the words small round stones, skipping across panic. The milky blue blinked, remembered brown. She inhaled as if the air had decided to sit down and stop making demands. She nodded, once, all the way from birth to now, and resumed existing as a person who would later have a tea and not talk about it. On a high gantry, an Ordo Xenos scribe, who had been writing so furiously his ink had started to smoke, took off his monocle and wiped his eye. He looked at the page and realized he had written the same sentence 20 times. Subject applies Occam's razor with his fist. He underlined it and almost shyly added, "This is probably fine." They reached the edge of the market again, where the signs for ammunition and produce argued about arrows. The servo skull pulsed a little light toward the latter. "Good news," it announced, proud of reality for behaving. A rerouted supply convoy dumped 4 crates of edible flora into the gutter to make room for ammunition. The flora survived. The ammunition survived. Morale improved. I have achieved a limited miracle. "Nice," Saitama said. He stepped over a fallen sign that said, "Repent" in letters large enough to be mistaken for orders. He lifted it, set it back on its nails. It stayed. Behind them, a sister of battle strode up the steps to the basilica, boots ringing on stone that had recently remembered how to be stone. She paused beside the librarian, glanced at the silver helms, at the embarrassed pile of chain murder, at the lack of ongoing catastrophe. "Report," she said. "Anomalous civilian," the librarian said, as if that explained anything people could use. He watched Saitama's receding back with the faintest tilt of his mouth. "Possible saint." "Saints don't shop," the sister said, and then thought about the logistics of pilgrimages and smiled despite herself. "Sometimes they do," she allowed, and went in to tend the shaken faithful. In the warp, the story that had been forming about a bald thing that hit hard resolved into 4 competing myths and a joke. The joke was the strongest. It was about a god of boredom. It didn't catch on. Not yet. Saitama reached the crates. The vegetables were bruised, but earnestly trying not to be. He chose with the precision of a surgeon and the indifference of a man who would eat anything if it had sauce. The servo skull hovered like a helpful sign. "Coupons remain culturally non-standard," it admitted, regretful. "But the vendor will accept blessings." "I've got a stack," Saitama said, and produced the clipped-together chimera of permissions and condemnations the interrogator had given him. The vendor, a woman with that calm scar and a stare that kept knives in their sheaths, glanced at the papers, then at him, then at the plaza where horror had failed to maintain interest. "Pay forward," she said simply, and put an extra onion in his bag, which is a miracle in any universe. He tied the bag tight to keep the eggs hugged and looked at the servo skull. It looked back, which is impressive for something with one lens. "Route to exit?" he asked. "Clear," it said, happy. "Secondary objective, avoid the orc choir that has spontaneously formed. Tertiary objective, decline invitations to join the Grey Knights again. Quaternary objective, continue not dying." "Working on it," he said, in exactly the same tone as before, and set off. Behind him the hymn rose, the market breathed, the seams stayed shut out of embarrassment, and somewhere far away, a throne of skulls beat faster because even boredom, sometimes, is a kind of challenge. They came for him in gold, not the gaudy parade guild of generals, but metal that looked like it had remembered the sun. The air shook with the soft, awful thud of heavy boots designed to be heard 2 rooms away. Men the size of myths stepped out of a teleport flare that smelled of ozone and oaths. Their armor was sculpted, lion-faced, haloed by plumes of crimson. Their spears thrummed with restrained decisions. Even the servo skull went still. Quill lowered like a banner at half-mast. "Adeptus Custodes," breathed someone who had run out of more ordinary reasons to be impressed. One of them, crest taller, voice calm as a verdict, inclined his helm to Saitama. "You are requested on Terra," he said. Not invited, not ordered exactly. Requested, in the way a planet requests a moon. Saitama checked the bag on his wrist. The eggs were fine. The cabbage leaned against the carton like a good friend. He looked at the servo skull. It bobbed, a tiny nod. "Okay," he said, and stepped into a circle of men no one stepped into. The world flexed. Teleport light folded the city into origami and unfolded it into a hangar that could have stored the idea of flight. Rows of thunderhawks slept under devotional cloth. Banners recorded victories, too large to write in prose. Incense smoked in vents because even machines prefer good smells when doing dangerous things. The custodian who spoke earlier gestured to a gun cutter with a prow like an aquila that had learned about fists. "We go to orbit," he said, "then Sol." "Do they have markets?" Saitama asked, only half hopeful. "On Terra," the custodian said, after a pause that suggested a man reconsidering doctrine, "there is everything." The gun cutter launched with the quiet confidence of hardware that never doubts paperwork. The hive fell away into a stack of light and shadow, then into a bruise of clouds, then into the black where stars lounged like bored nobility. Ahead, an interstellar ship hung in dock like a cathedral moored to scaffolding. Adamantium ribs, kilometer spires, windows the size of cities. Macro batteries glared from their housings. Saints with swords and wings stood along the prow as if the vacuum were a red carpet. Boarding was a hymn. Tech priests chanted machine code with the obsessive affection of monks grooming a dragon. The navigator's warded tower kept its shutters closed like a noblewoman with better things to do than make eye contact. Choirs of astropaths murmured the weather inside their heads. Today's quotient of storms, screams, and letters from ships that didn't yet exist. They noticed the quiet first. Geller Fields, which usually growled like wolves behind thick doors, purred. The oily taste of warp prophylaxis in the air thinned into something like clean laundry. The navigator peered through his veil and stopped mid-psalm, third eyelid dilating. He traced a route through the madness with a trembling finger and found the madness averting its eyes. On the second day, the astropathic choir fell asleep mid-ward, and no one scolded them because there were no nightmares to keep out. A junior tech adept ran a diagnostic on the nothing, found it entirely within parameters, and wrote a paper he would never publish because he valued his continued oxygen privileges. Men who had never gambled with hope did, quietly, in the mess, with small coins that still smelled of home planets they pretended to forget. Saitama ate what the ship called stew. It came in 2 colors, brown and also brown. He accepted each bowl with the sincerity of a monk receiving a vision. The custodes didn't eat around other people, but one of them stood nearby in a way that read as guard and also curious. "You are unafraid of the warp," the golden giant said finally. "I don't really think about it," Saitama said, which covered a lot. The journey to Sol felt like taking the express lane through a storm, while the storm politely pretended not to see you. War screams banged their heads against something soft and lost interest. The ship's chronometers ticked honest seconds instead of telling jokes. The Sol system rose like an edict. The picket line at the Mandeville Point challenged them with a string of code that would have taken a lesser ship an hour to answer. The custodian transmitted one syllable that meant, us. The picket line apologized and went back to practicing suspicion. Battlefleet Solar rode the lanes like armored ideas. The phalanx drifted in the dark like a rumor you could run aground on. Jovian shipyards spun spider silk megastructures, humming with unfinished wars. Mars glowed industrial red, a liturgical forge where prayers were welded shut. Terra was not a planet. It was a verdict carved into rock. Layers of hive and palace flowed over continents like poured gold. Macro cannon towers bristled. Void shields shimmered like air deciding to be glass. The Himalaysian mountains, everyone said the old word with love, as if history were a pet name, humped up under the Imperial Palace, which sprawled from horizon to horizon like a sleeping titan who had become architecture out of boredom. They landed in a bay large enough to dock a sin. Custodes bowed to no one. Everyone bowed to them. They did not make Saitama bow. They didn't ask him to kneel or recite or wash. They asked him to walk. There are many doors into the palace. Most are myths. The one they used was a gold throat that swallowed the sound of their footsteps and glittered with the condensed memory of victories. Statues watched, generals, saints, a woman who had once held a world by the throat and now held a book. Saitama's footsteps made the same soft slap they always did, and for once the sound did not echo in the wrong direction. Sisters of Silence stood along a corridor like punctuation. Their presence made the mind's edges sharp. The servo skull wobbled as if passing through a field of magnets. Even its little internal litany went quiet out of respect or self-preservation. A silent sister watched Saitama without expression and without thought, which is a special kind of attention. She signed with 2 fingers, a little tilt of the hand, and a custodian translated without moving his head. Scent of absence. He added, respectfully, "They find it pleasant." They crossed the eternity gate. They heard the hymn that never stops, a million throats, a million hearts, the machinery of devotion, cycling belief into power. The smell was wax and oil and old flowers. The floor beneath their feet was ancient, and no one talked about it being bone. The throne room was not a room. It was a mountain where a star had been chained. It was a machine that had learned to feel disappointed. Catwalks and bridges and galleries crisscrossed the vault like veins carrying clergy. Banks of archaic consoles ticked and sighed. Red-robed tech priests murmured to spirits who answer only to their own names. Cables as thick as hope ran from the dais to somewhere you don't ask about. Up there, upon there, fused to it, enthroned by it, was the Emperor. Saitama looked up the way a villager looks at a dam for the first time, impressed because of mass, not because of worship. He felt warmth, not like a sun, like standing behind a bakery on a winter morning. The warmth had teeth if it needed them. It had a crown. It had a memory of laughing. The will that poured from that throne brushed Saitama like a hand through rice. It skated over him, stuttered, adjusted, and came again. The contact was gentle and old and unimaginably tired. It asked 1,000 questions by existing. Name, purpose, weight, vector. It did not ask permission because it did not remember how. He answered by letting the hand land. His mind offered what it always had: a room with clean floors, a grocery list on the counter, a sense of having done the push-ups even when he didn't want to. It wasn't empty. It had window light. It had a cape hanging on the back of a chair. Somewhere, a mosquito whined and was ignored. The Emperor's will tasted that and did something it had not practiced in 10,000 years. It adjusted its expectations downward without unhappiness. It sent a thought broad as a continent and delicate as a surgeon's fingertip. The bridge of words built itself without grammar. "You are strange," came the sense, not in a voice, not in low Gothic or high, but in the way hot stone is frank. You have no hook, no story. You do not fit. Saitama thought back. Sorry. You stop things. The sense became curiosity draped in iron. Things that cannot stop. Things that do not end. You end them as if swatting midges. Saitama remembered a centipede in his apartment. He'd put it in a cup and put the cup outside because he'd felt generous that day. I just punch, he said aloud, because words are a habit. Would you punch for me? The question came as a continent with railways on it. Saitama felt bureaucrats stirring like ants on a sugar sculpture. He saw, without seeing, the High Lords as chess pieces carved from stone that didn't remember it used to be living. He saw fleets and schedules and a map of enemies like a rash. He felt in the next breath an old, vast grief that smelled like an empty chair. He looked at his bag. The eggs were whole. The cabbage was still a cabbage. The receipt crinkled. Can you point me to a grocery store first? He asked the most powerful thing he had ever met. The machine-laden silence of the throne made a sound that no one in the room, not the custodes, not the sisters, not the red robes draped in cables, had heard in their lives. It was not laughter. It was the relaxation of a tendon that had been clenched since a door had opened that should never have. Something in the air uncoiled the width of a hair. A single candle flame went from shivering to steady. A custodian's vox clicked, very soft. He was not asking anyone anything. He had simply realized he was still a man under all that gold. You must eat, came the thought, and it was not a jest. It was a concession from a general to a soldier who fought better with breakfast. There was a pause that, scaled to size, might have been the length of a blink. There is a breach. It was not on Terra. It was above the old moon, the one people had written poems about, when poems could still afford to be about moons. The webway under the palace hunched and snarled, black dogs under a door. Up by Luna, a new snarl began, a delicate tearing like lace being asked to be a net. Monitors on bays in orbit spat ugly numbers. A custodian on the command deck of a station over Mare Imbrium raised a hand and said the quiet kind of bad word. Saitama's servo skull, he had stopped thinking of it as a skull and started thinking of it as the skull, pinged. Advisory, it whispered, not to him, but to the room, which did not need it. Spatial deformation at Lunar Lagrange Point. Designation, uninvited door. The Emperor did not point. He did not bless. He does not move in ways that make sense to kneecaps. But a path opened from the throne, not through corridors, but through policy. Custodes looked up, turned, and the way became theirs. Saitama followed because that was the thing on the list right now. They crossed to a teleport dais, where the geometry had more precautions than a confessional. A red-robed tech priest with an augmetic face that looked like someone had tried to sculpt sadness out of augurs asked for a prayer and a signature. The prayer was a button press. The signature was a stamp, a piece of parchment hissed out of a slot with Machina Sancta stamped on it in 7 inks. The universe folded again, in a way that you feel in your teeth if your teeth have read the right books. They arrived inside a ring station that clung to Luna like a halo that knew it wasn't worthy. Screens watched emptiness decide to be the wrong kind of full. A hollowness opened out there, not a tear, but a sly hinge, and behind it eyes took interest. The station's void shields thrummed. Lances spooled up. Nothing fired because nothing had a target that made sense. The breach flowered, petals of geometry arguing with each other. A feeler of not light unfurled like a tongue-tasting glass. Tech priests recited machine rites in 6-part harmony. A naval officer with scars that had memos attached barked range numbers, because that is what range numbers are for. Saitama set his bag down beside a console. A junior ensign inched toward it, eyes huge, as if proximity to a grocery bag might pass as bravery. The servo skull hovered over the eggs like a mother with a parasol. The breach shivered, as if deciding whether to be dramatic or efficient. A shape began to push through, not a demon yet, but the intention of one. The intention had claws that were also verbs. The station's auspex painted a picture it refused to print. The officer with the memo scars reached for a big red lever that usually said "No" in Gothic, and was painted with all the warnings decades of terrified men could think of. Saitama walked to the viewport. Stars stared back with the polite disinterest of aristocrats who know they will outlive your scandal. He extended one finger toward the glass. He drew a neat circle in the air, as if marking a price on a window. He tapped. On the other side of the glass, reality made the noise of a jar lid popping. The breach pinched in embarrassment, then snapped shut the way people snap their mouths when they realize they've been humming in public. All the equipment that had been bracing itself flinched with nothing to resist. The machine spirits logged success and asked if anyone wanted tea. The naval officer's hand stayed on the lever, because dignity demanded at least one decisive pose. A tiny ripple ran along the lunar surface below, skittered across old seas like a mouse. In the throne room, thousands of kilometers away, the candle that had steadied did not go out again. It stood its ground. In the immaterium, shocks went out like gossip. Horn laughed because a fight had been denied someone else, which is still a kind of fight. Tzench added a new symbol to a wheel, labeled it boring, and found that the wheel spun more smoothly. Nurgle nodded approval at the concept of doors properly sealed. Hygiene is next to godliness when you are that kind of god. Slaanesh wrote the experience down in a small book under New Kinks, Denial, and closed it delicately, unsatisfied. The ring station exhaled. Men who had been clenching for 10 minutes unclenched for the first time in 10 years. The tech priest with the augur face leaned on his console, made a human sound, and later would insist it was a static discharge. A junior ensign daringly touched the grocery bag, felt the warmth of eggs through plastic, and decided to re-enlist. The custodes did not cheer. They nodded, which is cheering with a vocabulary. One of them turned his helmet, very slightly, toward Saitama, and said, in a tone that could be filed under admiration without anyone losing face, "Acceptable." The paperwork arrived before they were back on Terra. Of course it did. An inquisitorial courier, pale and combustible with importance, skidded into the ring station with a case handcuffed to his destiny. He opened it with 3 keys and 2 prayers. Inside lay a black parchment that smelled faintly of authority and the old ink of gone emperors. At the top was a stamped aquila with teeth. Below, in letters crisp enough to cut fingers, an authorization. Authorized civilian, pest control. Below that, a breathtaking quantity of footnotes, condemned in 30 sectors if required, blessed in 12. To be obeyed and or shot at discretion. A wax seal in red, another in black, a third in a color that didn't exist if you signed the wrong forms. Saitama took it, squinted, and tucked it into the bag next to the receipt and the cabbage. The courier swayed on his feet. "Do not fold," he whispered, voice cracking. Saitama folded it once so it would fit better. The courier put a hand against a wall and silently reassessed his relationship with fate. Back in the palace, the High Lords were having a meeting in a room with entirely too much ceiling. They had agendas and sub-agendas, and a document titled Proposal, Utilization of Anomalous Asset that had already accumulated annexes like barnacles. The master of the administratum had prepared a speech in 3 modalities: triumphant, cautious, and I told you so. The Fabricator General's representative wore a mask whose expression was an equation. The ecclesiarch had brought incense so rich it could declare war. The Officio Assassinorum's chair was empty in a way that suggested someone was sitting in it anyway. The meeting went badly until someone read a new memo that had just arrived, stamped from the throne room with a seal no one argued with. It said, in summary, "Let him walk." He did. They let him leave the throne room without a relic. No one tried to cut a relic from him, which was restraint of a high order. A confessor approached with a pen and a question about sainthood, and was gently intercepted by 7 feet of gold and a gaze that could shave marble. "Later," said the custodian, "or never." Down in a courtyard where the palace remembered it had once been a place with sky, Saitama found a stall. It should not have been there. It was there anyway. A woman with oil on her hands and laughter lines around her eyes sold skewers of something that insisted it had been fish in a previous life. He bought 2. One for him, one for the servo skull which lacked a mouth but appreciated the gesture so hard its quill made a little heart on a scrap of parchment. He sat on the edge of a low wall. Pilgrims flowed past in currents, each carrying a hope wrapped in a story. Custodes watched with the patience of statues that can move. A sister of silence stood within reach and stared into a place that didn't need protection anymore for the next 5 minutes. Somewhere, far below, the throne hummed. Somewhere, out among the defense stations over Luna, a big red lever went back to sleep. A bright-robed functionary approached at a speed that wanted to be respectful and kept falling back into eager. He carried a card with edges sharp enough to enact policy. "Travel papers," he announced. "Clearance to pass ports, planets, pickets. The Lex Imperial Messialis recognizes you as a temporary instrument of good order." He coughed. "And pest control." Saitama took the card. The print gleamed. He could not read most of it. He did not need to. The important bit was that doors would open instead of closing. He tucked it away and stood up. A custodian fell into step beside him. Not guarding, not herding. Accompanying. "Where will you go?" the golden man asked. "Where the sails are," Saitama said, which, for once, sounded like a plan instead of a joke. The custodian's mouth moved under the grill of his helm. If it had been anyone else, you would have called it a smile. "Then the galaxy is poorly priced. You will be busy." The shuttle that took him away from Terra was small, almost rude compared to the cathedrals he had arrived in. It bucked a little on launch, then settled into the smoothness of lanes that knew they had been asked nicely by someone who never asked. The planet fell away into browns and golds and prayers. The palace sat like a crown on the skull of a world that refused to die. He did not look back long. He had never been sentimental about skylines. He checked the bag. The eggs had survived an audience with God and a trip to the moon. The cabbage had learned patience. The servo skull hovered, lighter somehow, as if memory weighed less when the scary door stayed shut. "Primary objective, locate market," it said, buoyant. "Secondary objective, continue not dying. Tertiary objective, deny metaphysics undue influence. Quaternary objective, sample local cuisine as mission parameters permit." "Okay," Saitama said, and leaned his head back against the shuttle's cushion, which protested, being designed for armor, and finding cloth a moral failing. They punched back into the lanes between stars, where 1,000 tragedies were already in progress and 1,000 more were setting their alarms. Somewhere, a tomb world yawned. Somewhere an orc choir tried "Whoa" in soprano and was deeply disappointed. Somewhere the elder wrote a poem about a bald man they would pretend not to be afraid of. Somewhere a rogue trader considered selling the story of what had just happened and decided to stay inexplicably quiet for one more day. On Terra, in a room where candles never go out because a machine unashamedly helps them, the Emperor regarded the space his will had just touched. There was no mark. That, in itself, was a mark. A filament of intent drifted like a spider thread and settled over a corner of his immeasurable mind that had stored away tiny, impractical things. The sound of rain on a particular window. The way fresh bread breaks. The face of a friend he had not killed. Hope is a big word. It does not live in throne rooms. But sometimes a smaller version of it sneaks in, wearing the clothes of a joke. On a transport ship's galley table, Saitama spread his purchases. Eggs, scallions, onions, cabbage, a lion-faced stamp of authorization to close the doors. Things should not have opened, He found a pan with sincere dents. He cracked eggs. The yolks held together. He smiled a little. Even heroes cook. When the klaxon sounded somewhere on the lower decks, different siren, different flavor of emergency. He lifted the pan off the flame with one hand and stood up, bag looped on his wrist, travel card in his pocket, and whatever the galaxy thought it was about to do next, already less interested in happening.